I submitted the withdrawal notice at 09 station time, a single document, 4 pages, formally signed by every head of government on Earth, and the presiding councillor read the first paragraph, set it down, and made the sound that the Vhellari make when something strikes them as too absurd for genuine response. A low, wet, dismissive click that their translation bead renders, with admirable honesty, as adorable. My name is Director Thomas Reyes. I am 68 years old. I spent 21 years as an infrastructure analyst for the United Earth Logistics Authority, 13 years as the Deputy Administrator of Earth's Transit Systems Division, and the last 8 years as Earth's Senior Representative to the Galactic Council's Interstellar Commerce and Transit Committee, a body that sounded technical and bureaucratic, and was, in practice, the single most important committee in the entire council structure, because it controlled something that every species in galactic space depended on completely and thought about almost never. It controlled the gates. I want to be precise about what I mean by gates, because the word does a poor job of conveying what we are actually discussing. The Council's transit infrastructure was a network of 1,400 jump gates distributed across charted space, built and maintained over 300 years by the founding 5 species, connecting every member world to every other member world through instantaneous transit corridors that made interstellar civilization possible in any practical sense. Without the gates, a journey between 2 systems that took minutes through a gate could take years through conventional travel. The gates were not a convenience. They were the circulatory system of the entire council. Every trade route, every diplomatic mission, every military deployment, every family visiting relatives on a colony world 3 systems away moved through them. Earth had been a member of the council for 63 years. Earth had been paying transit fees to use that network for 63 years, and Earth had never, not once in 63 years, been permitted to construct a gate of its own. This was not an oversight. The construction rights for jump gate technology were controlled exclusively by the founding 5 species under a licensing framework so carefully constructed that no junior or observer member had ever successfully challenged it. The official justification, repeated in committee sessions for 63 years, with the specific patience of people repeating something they know does not need to be true to be effective, was that gate construction required levels of technical sophistication and safety certification that only the founding 5 had achieved. The unofficial reality, which everyone in the committee understood and no one said aloud, was that the gate network was the single greatest source of leverage the founding 5 possessed over every other species in the council, and they had no intention of sharing it. I submitted Earth's formal withdrawal notice on a Tuesday morning, 4 pages, signed by every head of government on a planet that had spent 63 years being told it could use the door but could never own one. The presiding councillor, an elderly Lyrosi female named Councillor Theth, who had served in her position for over a century, picked the document back up after her colleague's dismissive click had finished echoing through the chamber, and read the remaining 3 pages in silence. When she finished, she looked at me for a long moment. "Director Reyes," she said. Her translator rendered her tone as carefully neutral, which from Councillor Theth meant she was choosing her words with more precision than the room currently warranted. "This document states that Earth intends to formally withdraw from the Galactic Council, effective in 30 days. "That's correct," I said. "Withdrawal entails forfeiture of all council infrastructure access," she said, "including transit gate privileges." "We understand that," I said. The Vhellari delegate, a senior trade representative named Corvith, whose translator I had grown accustomed to over 8 years of largely unpleasant committee sessions, made another wet clicking sound, longer this time, and his bead rendered it as something between amusement and pity. "Director Reyes," Corvith said, "I would ask that you reconsider, not out of any particular concern for Earth's interests, but out of professional courtesy. Your government appears to believe this gesture carries weight. It does not. Earth represents 0.4% of total council trade volume. Your withdrawal will be noted, filed, and forgotten within a fiscal quarter." I let that sit for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long. 30 days, I said. "Thank you for your time, Councillor." I collected my data case and walked out of the Grand Conclave chamber. And behind me I heard the particular quality of laughter that fills a room when several hundred species have simultaneously decided that something is not worth taking seriously. I had been hoping for exactly that reaction. The corridor outside Theta Station's chamber level was long and cold and lit in the calming blue tones the Council's architects favored, and I walked it at a measured pace because I had learned, over 8 years, that the pace at which you leave a room communicates almost as much as anything you say inside it. Osivith was waiting near the junction to the administrative wing. The Lethrani clerk had worked in the Council's infrastructure licensing division for 12 years, and had, somewhere in the middle of those 12 years, developed the specific quality of conscience that makes a bureaucrat extremely useful to people working against the system they administer. "They're laughing," Osivith said quietly, falling into step beside me. "I know," I said. "You wanted them to." "I did." We walked another 20 meters in silence. Then Osivith said even more quietly, "The relay construction. It's finished?" "It's finished," I said. "All 78? All 78. Osivith's color panels flickered through a sequence I had learned, over years of careful observation, indicated something between professional satisfaction and genuine awe. 12 years, the clerk said. I processed 3 of the licensing exemption applications myself. I never once connected them. That was the point, I said. We reached the junction where Osivith's path diverged toward the administrative wing. The clerk paused. "Director," Osivith said, "when this is finished, the licensing division, will there be a position for someone who understood, eventually, what they were filing paperwork for?" I looked at Osivith for a moment. "There will always be a position," I said, "for someone who chose to understand." Osivith peeled away toward the administrative wing. I continued toward the docking bays, and I did not look back. And behind me, the sound of the chamber's laughter was still audible faintly through the corridor walls. The specific sound of several hundred species, who had just watched the galaxy's smallest meaningful trading partner threaten to take its ball and go home, and had concluded, with complete and unanimous confidence, that nobody would notice. I want to tell you about Dr. Mei Lin Zhao, because nothing that happened in the following 11 days makes sense without understanding her first, and because the story of Earth's withdrawal from the Galactic Council is, underneath everything else, the story of a single insight she had 44 years ago and refused to let go of. Mei Lin was born in Chengdu in 2036, the daughter of a civil engineer father and a theoretical physicist mother, and she spent the first 18 years of her career studying something that the Galactic Council's technology observers, who monitored human research with the specific complacent attention of people watching something they have already decided cannot threaten them, categorized as exotic space-time topology, theoretical, non-applied. She was studying the mathematics underlying the Council's own jumpgate technology, not to build one, to understand, with the precision of someone who had decided that understanding a thing fully was the only honest way to evaluate whether it was actually as exclusive as everyone claimed. Exactly why the Founding Five insisted that gate construction required capabilities no other species could achieve. It took her 6 years to determine that this was not true. The Council's jump gates worked by establishing a stable topological fold between 2 fixed points in space-time, anchored by enormous structures. Each gate was approximately 4 kilometers in diameter. That required, according to the Founding Five's official technical disclosures, exotic matter production capabilities, computational modeling resources, and material science achievements that genuinely were beyond what most Council species had developed. This part was true. What Mei Lin discovered in a paper she wrote in 2071 and submitted to a closed internal review at Earth's Classified Physics Directorate, rather than to any Council journal, was that the Founding Five's gate technology represented one specific engineering solution to the underlying physics problem, optimized for the scale and traffic volume of their 300-year-old network, and that it was not the only viable solution. She had found another one. It was smaller. It was slower to construct. It required, in her initial estimate, technology that Earth could plausibly develop within 15 to 20 years if the research was prioritized and funded continuously, which was an enormous if, given that nothing about this work could ever be disclosed to the Council without immediately triggering an aggressive licensing dispute and very likely outright suppression. Her solution did not produce a gate capable of moving capital ships or large cargo convoys. It produced something the Council's engineers, if they had ever seen the specifications, would have dismissed as a relay, a smaller, more limited transit point, capable of moving smaller vessels, and critically, capable of being constructed in a fraction of the time and material cost of a full Council gate, using manufacturing techniques and material sourcing that did not require any license the Council controlled. Mei Lin's paper concluded with a single recommendation, written with the specific dry understatement of a physicist who understood she was proposing something that would take decades and that she would very likely not live to see completed. That Earth begin, immediately and in complete secrecy, constructing an independent relay network using her framework, positioned to connect Earth and its colonies to systems and trade routes that lay just beyond the Council's existing gate infrastructure, in locations the Founding Five's network had never found commercially interesting enough to develop themselves. The joint government session that reviewed her paper argued about it for 9 months. The argument was not really about the physics, which Earth's own review board had verified independently within the first 3 months and confirmed was sound. The argument was about whether a species that had been a Council member for less than a decade should commit itself to a multi-decade clandestine infrastructure project on the basis of a single physicist's conviction that the Council's most jealously guarded technological monopoly was not, in fact, the technological marvel it presented itself as they voted to fund it. The program was given a name that Mei Lin herself selected and that I have always found appropriately understated for something this consequential: the Open Road Initiative. Mei Lin died 9 years before the withdrawal notice at 71 in a research facility built into a converted iron mine in northern Sweden, of complications from a respiratory illness that her medical team believed was unrelated to her work, and that she, with characteristic dry humor according to her notes, attributed to 40 years of underground facilities and bad ventilation budgeting. She did not live to see a single relay completed. The first one, designated Relay 1 and positioned in a system 3 light-years beyond the Council's nearest gate to Earth, was completed 18 months after her death. Her research team dedicated it to her in a small private ceremony that was never recorded in any official program documentation, because nothing about the Open Road Initiative was ever recorded in documentation that could be traced. I was introduced to the program 11 years ago, 2 years before I joined the Interstellar Commerce and Transit Committee, in a briefing that Director Sarah Okonkwo, Mei Lin's successor, and the woman who had spent the preceding 15 years turning a single physicist's theoretical framework into an operational construction program, delivered to me personally in the Sweden facility, in the same converted iron mine where Mei Lin had done her foundational work. Sarah was 60 years old when I met her, and she had the specific quality of someone who had spent her entire adult life managing something too large and too slow-moving to ever feel finished. She showed me the program's status with the careful, comprehensive thoroughness of someone who understood that I was about to spend years representing this program's interests in a chamber full of people who must never suspect it existed. By the time I joined the committee, the Open Road Initiative had completed 31 relays. By the time I submitted the withdrawal notice, it had completed 78. I want to describe the construction challenge honestly, because the difficulty of what was accomplished is easy to understate if you simply hear the number 78 and move on. Each relay required a stable orbital or deep space construction site, materials that could not be sourced through any Council-licensed supplier without triggering scrutiny, a construction crew that could operate for years in complete isolation without the kind of support infrastructure that normally surrounds large engineering projects, and absolute secrecy maintained across a workforce that, by the final year of construction, numbered just under 19,000 people. The relays were built using a manufacturing approach that Sarah's team called distributed fabrication. No single facility ever produced more than a fraction of any relay's components, and the components themselves were designed, wherever possible to resemble standard deep space infrastructure equipment, communications relays, navigation beacons, mining support platforms. A council inspector who happened to encounter a partially completed relay site, which did happen on 4 occasions over the program's life, would have seen something that looked, on every available scanning method, like an ambitious but unremarkable piece of human commercial infrastructure. The actual function of the structure was embedded in component specifications and assembly sequences, distributed across the design documentation of 41 separate, legitimate, council-licensed commercial entities, none of whom had complete knowledge of what they were ultimately contributing to: 78 relays, connecting Earth, all 4 major human colony worlds. And this was the detail that mattered most, the detail that Mei Lin had identified as the actual strategic value of her framework 44 years earlier: 31 independent trade and resource systems that lay just beyond the edge of the Council's existing gate network. Systems the Founding Five's infrastructure had simply never been extended to, because the cost of extension had never been judged worthwhile against the limited commercial interest those systems represented. Those 31 systems were not council members. They were independent settlements, minor trading outposts, and in several cases entirely unaffiliated minor species who had never had practical access to the Council's gate network and had, as a result, never had practical access to the broader galactic economy at all. For 63 years, Earth had been a customer of the Council's gate network, paying transit fees to move along corridors the Founding Five controlled completely. For the last 11 years, in complete secret, Earth had also been building its own network, smaller, slower, less capable in raw capacity, but reaching into space the Council's gates had never bothered to reach, connecting Earth not just to its own colonies, but to 31 systems that no other council member could economically access at all. The 30 days began on the morning I submitted the withdrawal notice. I returned to Earth on the 3rd day, having spent the intervening time fielding the predictable wave of informal, diplomatic contact from species whose governments had decided that whatever Earth was doing deserved a closer look, even if the formal council response remained dismissive. I spent the 4th through 10th days in the Sweden facility with Sarah Okonkwo, reviewing the activation sequence with the specific obsessive thoroughness that a project 11 years in construction deserves before its first real test. The activation was not, in any dramatic sense, an event. This is something I have had to explain many times since, because people expect a moment of ignition, a visible transformation, something cinematic. What actually happened on day 11 was that 78 relays that had been sitting completed and dormant, some of them for as long as 6 years, waiting for the network to reach sufficient density to be useful, received a synchronized activation signal and began operating as a connected transit network. The signal was transmitted through the same kind of distributed, low-signature communication architecture that the relays themselves had been built with, no single transmission anyone could intercept and trace. A cascading activation sequence that propagated relay to relay, each one confirming its neighbor's status before powering its own transit field, completing across the full 78 relay network in approximately 40 minutes. At the end of those 40 minutes, every human ship registered to use the network, and registration had been conducted quietly over the preceding 2 years through channels that looked, to any outside observer, like standard navigational software updates, could move between Earth, its 4 colony worlds, and 31 previously unreachable trade systems, in transit times measured in minutes rather than years. The Council's gate network had not been damaged. It had not been disabled. It continued operating exactly as it always had, moving exactly the traffic it had always moved, between exactly the systems it had always connected. What changed was that Earth's traffic simply stopped using it. Every human commercial vessel that had been queued for Council gate transit canceled its reservation. Every human trade convoy moving along Council-licensed corridors rerouted. Every human diplomatic and civilian vessel that had, for 63 years, paid transit fees to move along infrastructure the Founding Five controlled, simply began moving along infrastructure that the Founding Five did not know existed and could not control. I was told later, by Osivith, that the Council's Gate Traffic Monitoring Division noticed the change within 6 hours, because the Monitoring Division's systems were specifically designed to flag exactly this kind of anomaly. A member species' commercial traffic volume dropping to functionally zero across the licensed network, without any corresponding increase in conventional sublight travel that might explain where that traffic had gone. They could see that human ships were not using the gates. They could not see where human ships were going instead. Because the relay network operated on transit principles, their own gate technology had never been designed to detect. The same way Mei Lin's original mathematics had described a solution to the underlying physics problem that simply did not register on instruments calibrated to look for the founding five's specific engineering approach. On day 14, 3 days after activation, the Council's Trade Committee convened an emergency session. I was not invited, which I had expected, since Earth's formal withdrawal was already in process, and our seat on the committee was, as far as the Council's procedures were concerned, already vacated in all but the final week. I know what was discussed because Osivith, who had by then been quietly reassigned to a junior administrative role in the Trade Monitoring Division, specifically because the clerk's careful, conscientious work over the preceding years had earned a reputation for reliability, had access to the session's procedural summary and transmitted it to me through a method I will not describe. The committee's first item of business was a report from the Gate Traffic Monitoring Division, confirming that human commercial and diplomatic traffic through Council infrastructure had dropped to zero on day 11 and remained at zero. The committee's second item of business was a preliminary economic impact assessment, prepared by a Shen Collective cluster analyst, examining what zero human gate traffic actually meant for the systems and trade routes Earth's commercial activity had touched. This is where the Council's confident dismissal, Corvith's 0.4% of total Council trade volume, revealed itself as a number that was technically accurate and substantively almost meaningless, in the specific way that a single number can describe something correctly while completely failing to describe what actually matters about it. Earth's 0.4% of total trade volume was not evenly distributed across the Council's economy. It was concentrated heavily and specifically in exactly the kind of secondary logistics and distribution work that Project Meridian, a separate human initiative whose existence the Council would not discover for several more years, had also been quietly building toward, and in agricultural and industrial goods that several Council member species, particularly smaller and junior members operating near the boundary of Council space, had come to depend on disproportionately to their size. More significantly, Earth's commercial traffic had, over the preceding 15 years, been the primary vector connecting the Council's gate network to several minor trading partners and unaffiliated systems near the network's outer edge. Places where Earth's ships had been willing to make the longer, less profitable runs that the larger, more established Council trading houses had judged not worth the gate transit fees relative to the cargo value involved. Earth had been doing the unglamorous logistics work at the edges of the network because it was the only work a junior member with limited gate access priority could profitably do. When Earth's ships stopped appearing, those edge connections did not simply lose one trading partner among many. In several cases, they lost their only reliable connection to the broader Council economy entirely. The Shen Collective Analyst's assessment, according to Osivith's summary, used the specific, careful, hedged language that analysts use when they are delivering a conclusion they suspect their audience does not want to hear. That continued absence of human commercial traffic would produce, within 60 to 90 days, supply disruptions affecting 14 minor member species and an estimated 40 unaffiliated systems with existing trade relationships dependent on human logistics capacity, and that the secondary effects of those disruptions on the broader network's stability could not yet be fully modeled. The committee's third item of business, which Osivith described as producing a silence that lasted nearly 2 full minutes, was the question that the Shen Collective Analyst's own report had not been asked to address, but that every committee member in the room was now privately calculating. If Earth's ships were not using the Council's gate network, What network were they using instead? On day 16, I received a direct communication request from Councillor Theth's office, not routed through the Interstellar Commerce and Transit Committee, which technically no longer had any obligation to communicate with a withdrawing member, but sent directly to me, personally, in language that the presiding councillor's staff reserved for matters they considered to require unusual discretion. I accepted the call from a small office in Geneva, with Sarah Okonkwo seated beside me, the activation confirmation data from all 78 relays displayed on a secondary screen between us. Councillor Theth appeared on the screen looking, for the first time in the 8 years I had known her, like someone who had spent several consecutive nights without adequate sleep. "Director Reyes," she said, "I will be direct with you, which I understand is somewhat unusual for these proceedings. I appreciate that, Councillor. The Interstellar Commerce and Transit Committee has noted a complete cessation of human gate traffic beginning 11 days ago, with no corresponding increase in conventional travel methods that would explain the change." "That's correct," I said. "The committee's economic analysis indicates this cessation is producing measurable disruption to trade relationships involving 14 member species and a number of unaffiliated systems, and that this disruption is projected to worsen." "I've seen a version of that analysis," I said, which was true, and which I did not elaborate on. She was quiet for a moment. "Director Reyes, I would like to ask you directly, has Earth developed alternative transit infrastructure?" I had spent 2 days with Sarah and Earth's full diplomatic and legal team, considering exactly how to answer this question when it was eventually asked, because I had known it would be asked, and because the honest answer required a precision that protected the program's specifications, while not requiring me to lie to a presiding councillor whose impartiality I had genuinely come to respect over 8 years. "Councillor," I said, "Earth has developed transit capability that does not depend on council-licensed gate technology, does not utilize any council infrastructure, and was constructed entirely using human resources, human labor, and human-developed engineering, in space that has never been part of any council member's territorial claim. We believe this development falls entirely within Earth's sovereign right to develop its own technology and infrastructure, and we have not violated any provision of council law in constructing it." There was a long silence. "You built your own gate network," she said. "We built something that achieves a comparable function," I said. "I would not describe it as a gate network because it does not use gate technology. I would describe it as a relay network built on different physical principles, achieving a similar practical outcome at a smaller individual scale." "How long?" she asked. 11 years of construction," I said. 44 years since the foundational research began." She looked at me for a long moment with an expression that I had genuinely never seen on her face in 8 years of largely formal interaction. "While you sat in our committee sessions," she said slowly, "for 8 years, listening to discussions of gate licensing allocation, transit fee structures, infrastructure investment priorities that excluded Earth from gate construction rights." "Yes, Councillor," I said. "You already had an alternative." "We had been building one," I said, "since before I joined the committee. I did not know the full operational details myself until 2 years before I joined. The program predates my involvement by several decades." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, in a tone that had shifted from formal inquiry to something I can only describe as genuine, weary curiosity, "Why did you stay in the committee at all these past 8 years if you already knew this was coming?" I considered the question carefully because it deserved a careful answer. "Because the relay network connects Earth to 31 systems the Council's gates never reached," I said. "It does not connect Earth to the Council's existing gate-accessible trade routes, which still represent the majority of galactic commerce. We are not trying to replace your network, Councillor. We are trying to ensure that Earth is never again entirely dependent on infrastructure controlled exclusively by species who have made clear for 63 years that we would never be permitted to own a piece of it." The formal negotiations that followed the activation took place over the remaining 9 days of the 30-day withdrawal window, and they did not resemble anything in Council history. Because the Council had never previously negotiated with a member that had, in the middle of its own withdrawal process, demonstrated it no longer required the thing the Council was offering as leverage. The Vhellari delegation, led by Corvith, attempted initially to argue that the relay network constituted a violation of the Council's technology non-proliferation accords, on the theory that any transit technology functionally comparable to gate technology should fall under the same licensing restrictions, regardless of its underlying engineering principles. Earth's legal team, the same 600 scholar team that had, by this point in our broader, quieter conflicts with the Council, become extremely well-practiced at this specific genre of argument, responded with documentation demonstrating that the Non-Proliferation Accords explicitly defined their scope by reference to the Founding Five's patented gate technology specifications, not by reference to functional transit capability in general, and that Mei Lin's underlying physics had been independently developed using no licensed or proprietary information. Corvith's objection did not survive the legal review. I do not believe he expected it to. I believe, based on his demeanor in the sessions that followed, that he raised it because raising it was the only available response to a situation his diplomatic training had not prepared him for, and because making the objection, even unsuccessfully, preserved some sense of having done something in a moment when there was, in fact, very little left to do. The actual negotiation, once the legal posturing concluded, centered on a much simpler question. Did Earth intend to proceed with full withdrawal, or was there a basis for remaining in the Council under revised terms? I want to be honest about something here, because I have been asked many times in the years since whether Earth's withdrawal notice was, from the beginning, a negotiating tactic rather than a genuine intention. The honest answer is that it was both, and that the distinction matters less than people assume. The withdrawal notice was genuine. Earth's government had, in fact, concluded that membership under the existing terms, permanent exclusion from gate construction rights, permanent dependence on infrastructure we could never own a share of, permanent status as a paying customer in a system we could never meaningfully shape, was no longer something we were willing to accept indefinitely. We were prepared to withdraw. We had built the relay network specifically so that withdrawal would be survivable rather than catastrophic. But we also understood, the moment the relay network activated and the Council's economic analysis began revealing the disruption that would follow, that full withdrawal was not actually the outcome that served Earth's interests best. Full withdrawal meant permanently forfeiting access to the Council's existing gate network and the much larger volume of established trade routes it serviced. What served Earth's interests best was remaining a Council member, but on terms that finally reflected what 63 years of unequal access had made clear was overdue. Recognition of Earth's right to develop and operate independent transit infrastructure, and a renegotiation of the gate construction licensing framework that had excluded us from the start. On day 26, 4 days before the withdrawal would have taken legal effect, the Council's full membership voted on a revised accord. The accord recognized Earth's relay network as sovereign human infrastructure, not subject to Council licensing requirements. Provided Earth disclosed its existence and general operational parameters under the same transparency provisions that governed other members' independent technological developments. The accord also revised the gate construction licensing framework, opening a path, gradual, heavily negotiated, not the full and immediate access I would have preferred, but real and enforceable, for non-founding member species to petition for gate construction rights under specific conditions related to demonstrated need and technical capability. The vote passed 298 to 89. The Vhellari voted against. Several of their closest allies among the Founding Five abstained rather than vote against a measure that, by that point, every member species in the chamber understood had been forced into existence by Earth's demonstration that the Founding Five's monopoly on interstellar infrastructure was not, in fact, the unbreachable technical achievement it had been presented as for 3 centuries. In the corridor afterward, Corvith found me near the exit to the docking bays. His translator bead was active. 78 relays, he said. 11 years of construction. 44 years since the original research. Yes, I said. While we discussed licensing allocation in committee sessions for 63 years, he said, treating Earth's exclusion as a settled, permanent fact. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Why did your government wait? If the relay network was complete, why submit a withdrawal notice at all, rather than simply activating it and presenting us with a fact? I thought about Mei Lin Zhao, who had died 9 years before seeing a single relay completed, and about the specific patient discipline of a program that had spent 44 years building toward a moment its founder would never witness, and about the difference between having leverage and choosing the moment to use it. Because the laughter mattered, I said. We needed you to genuinely believe the withdrawal notice meant nothing, so that the activation would mean everything. He looked at me for a long moment, and his expression did something I had not seen in 8 years of committee sessions, something that was not quite respect, and was not quite something else, but sat somewhere in the space between the two. You let us laugh, he said. For 11 days, I said. Yes, I have a house now on the western edge of what was once farmland outside Geneva, close enough to the city that I can see its lights at night, far enough that the sky above my garden is genuinely dark when the clouds clear. I retired 18 months after the revised accord passed, after 31 years in public service that I had never planned to spend the way I ended up spending them. The relay network has grown since activation. 40 additional relays have been constructed in the years since, extending human transit capability to 19 additional systems, several of which have since petitioned for their own council membership through a process that did not exist before Earth's withdrawal forced the founding five to acknowledge that the galaxy contained more economic activity than their 300-year-old network had ever bothered to reach. Sarah Okonkwo still directs the Open Road Initiative, though it operates very differently now, openly, transparently, disclosed under the Accord's provisions, expanding through standard infrastructure investment rather than secret construction. She told me at the dedication ceremony for Relay 40 that she sometimes finds the openness strange after 15 years of secrecy, the way a person who has spent years speaking quietly might find their own raised voice unfamiliar. Mei Lin Zhao's name is engraved on a small plaque at the entrance to Relay 1, the first one completed, the one she never lived to see activated. Her granddaughter, who works as a transit systems engineer for the now public Open Road Initiative, visits it twice a year. I asked her once at a program anniversary event what she thought her grandmother would have made of the relay network's current scale. She thought about it for a while before answering. I think she would have asked when we were starting the next 40, she said. My neighbor's daughter is 10 years old. Her name is Elsa, and she has the specific particular curiosity that some children develop early about systems and infrastructure. The kind of curiosity that makes her ask, when we are sitting in my garden in the evening watching the lights of distant Geneva, not what happened, but how it worked. My teacher said you built a whole new way to travel through space, she said last spring, without using the council's gates. That's right, I said. How does it work, if it's not the same as the gates? I thought about how to explain Mei Lin's framework to a 10-year-old in a way that was honest without requiring 40 minutes of topology. The council's gates solve a problem one way, I said. A very good way, but the only way they ever tried. We found a different way to solve the same problem, smaller, slower, but ours. She considered this with the serious expression she gets when she's deciding whether an explanation is sufficient. Why didn't they find the other way first? She said, if it was right there to find. I thought about 63 years of committee sessions, and a single physicist's 6 years of careful work, and the specific, deliberate confidence of a species that had been the most advanced civilization in its corner of the galaxy for 300 years, and had, somewhere in those 300 years, stopped genuinely looking for things it had already decided did not exist. Because they stopped looking, I said, a long time before we started. She seemed satisfied with this. She went back to watching the lights of the city, and I sat with her in the quiet of the evening, and above us, somewhere in the dark, 78 relays and counting, carried human ships and human cargo and human travelers between worlds the council's gates had never reached, sailing on in the patient, unglamorous permanent way of infrastructure built by people who understood that the point was never to win the argument in the room. It was to make sure that, eventually, you no longer needed to.